A green cooler sits in nearly every American garage on Earth. The factory that built it, bulldozed, turned into a parking lot. That single lamp became an empire. It armed over 1 million American soldiers in World War II. It built the Great American Campsite from scratch. At its peak, it ran factories across 8 states and 6 countries. Then it all came apart, sold and sold again and sold again, until the family name behind it vanished completely. This is the true story of the Coleman factory. How one man's lucky discovery built an empire that lit up America, and how that empire was torn apart, brick by brick. Chapter 1. The Salesman Who Saw the Light, William Coffin. Coleman was born on May 21, 1870, in Chatham, New York. His family moved west early. He grew up in Labette County, Kansas, on land that demanded hard work and gave little back. He studied at the State Teachers College in Emporia. He taught school for a year. It wasn't enough, so he enrolled in law school at the University of Kansas, chasing something bigger than a rural classroom. Then the money ran out. No degree, no safety net. Just a young man with a suitcase full of typewriters, traveling the American South, trying to sell machines that most people couldn't afford and didn't understand. In 1899, that road led him to Blotton, Alabama. It was a coal town, dirt streets, wooden sidewalks. Not the kind of place where a man expects to find his future. But one evening, walking past a drugstore, Coleman stopped. A lamp in the window burned white hot, sharper and brighter than anything he'd seen. This wasn't ordinary lamplight. It was the efficient lamp, invented by W.H. Irby. A gasoline lamp pressurized to force fuel through a mantle instead of a wick. No flicker, no smoke, just a hard, steady glow that put every kerosene lantern in America to shame. Coleman didn't know engineering. He didn't need to. He understood something simpler. Everyone around him was still living in the dark, and this lamp could fix that. He was broke. He was without a degree. He had failed at his last job selling machines nobody wanted. So how did this failed typewriter salesman turn one lamp in a drugstore window into an empire that would light up an entire nation? Chapter 2. Selling light, not just lamps. Coleman signed on to sell the Irby Gilliland lamp. It should have been easy. The light spoke for itself, but the lamps kept failing. Carbon built up inside the mantle. Pressure dropped. The glow died within weeks. And by then, the salesman was long gone, on to the next town. Word spreads fast in small places. Customers stopped trusting the product. They stopped trusting Coleman. He needed a different pitch, not a sale, a promise. So he built one. Customers wouldn't buy the lamp outright. They'd rent it, $1 a week. If it broke, Coleman fixed it himself, free of charge. No risk, no excuses, just light, guaranteed. In 1900, he formalized the idea in Kingfisher, in what was then Oklahoma Territory, under a new name, the Hydrocarbon Light Company. It wasn't a lamp company anymore. It was a light company. The distinction mattered. The model worked. Every dollar earned went straight back into the business. Coleman pushed into neighboring towns, one rental route at a time. Growth demanded capital, and family stepped in. 2 brothers-in-law put up $2,000 for an 8% stake. It was the company's first real infusion of outside money. By 1902, demand had outgrown Oklahoma Territory entirely. Coleman relocated headquarters to Wichita, Kansas. A decision that would tie his name to that city for more than 100 years. A year later, in 1903, he stopped renting someone else's invention. He bought the patent to the efficient lamp outright, refined its design, and gave it a name that finally belonged to him. The Coleman arc lamp. The rental boy from Alabama now owned the light itself. Chapter 3. The factory takes shape. By 1905, Coleman had a product. Now he needed proof. So he did something no lamp salesman had tried before. He lit up a night football game at Fairmount College, the school that would later become Wichita State University. Players ran under a white glow that no gas lamp in Kansas could match. Word of that night traveled fast, and it traveled for free. 2 years later, in 1907, the company changed shape again. It became the Hydrocarbon Company, and its product line grew with it. Coleman engineers built hollow wire lighting systems, wiring entire buildings with the same pressurized principle that had once lit a single drugstore window. Then, in 1909, Coleman stopped improving someone else's invention and designed his own. He created a portable table lamp with a flat-based gasoline fount, a shape nobody else had built. It was small, it was stable, it was entirely his. One more detail followed, almost as an afterthought. Coleman added a screen around the mantle to keep insects out. It seemed minor at the time, but that single screen meant a lamp could now survive a night outdoors, bugs and all. Nobody knew it yet, but that small addition had just opened the door to camping. In 1913, the growing company took the name it would carry for decades, the Coleman Lamp Company. And behind every one of these changes stood a physical place. In Wichita, the company built out its manufacturing home, a set of structures raised through the 1920s, anchored by Plant A, a 4-story brick building completed in 1929. For more than 60 years, this was where the ideas turned into objects, where lamps and later stoves rolled off the line by the thousands. The name had changed 3 times in a decade, but the factory floor stayed the same, and it was about to prove itself in ways no marketing stunt ever could. Chapter 4. Lighting Rural America. At the start of the 20th century, most of rural America still lived without electricity. Farms sat miles from any power line. Small town stores closed at dusk because there was nothing left to see by. Clinics in remote counties treated patients under the same dim, flickering light that had barely changed in 100 years. Into that darkness, Coleman didn't just sell lamps. The company sold heat too. Stoves and heaters followed the same pressurized gasoline principle that had made the lamp so bright. And for families with no grid to plug into, that principle meant something close to survival. A farmer could finally work past sundown. A shopkeeper could stay open another hour. A rural doctor could see a wound clearly enough to stitch it properly. The 1920s pushed the company even further outward. Camp stoves joined the lineup, built for people who needed heat somewhere the walls of a house couldn't reach. Cooking ranges followed, scaled up for kitchens that had never known anything but a wood-burning stove. Hot plates came next, compact and simple, built for the smallest spaces imaginable. None of this was a random scramble for new markets. It followed a straight line of logic. A company built to solve one problem, the absence of light, was uniquely positioned to solve every other problem that came from the same root cause, the absence of energy itself. Heat, cooking, warmth. They were all the same fight against the dark, just fought with different tools. Other manufacturers sold similar equipment during these years. Most of them competed on price alone, and most of them lost customers the same way Coleman almost had back in Alabama, with products that failed the moment nobody was watching. Coleman took a different approach. Maintenance mattered as much as manufacturing. Every improvement to a lamp or stove got folded back into the next model, instead of sitting on a shelf as a one-time fix. The company wasn't just moving units off a factory floor. It was building a reputation, one repaired lamp and one reliable stove at a time. And in a part of the country where trust traveled slower than electricity ever would, that reputation became the real product. By the time the decade closed, Coleman wasn't a lamp company anymore, not by any honest definition. It was something closer to a utility. one that rural America carried home in a box, lit with a match, and trusted to work exactly the same way tomorrow as it had today. Chapter 5. The GI pocket stove and the war effort changes what a factory is for. When the United States entered the Second World War, Coleman stopped thinking about farms and campsites and started thinking about soldiers freezing in foxholes on the other side of the world. The answer was the GI pocket stove. It was small enough to fit inside a jacket pocket, light enough to carry for miles, and tough enough to survive conditions that would have destroyed a civilian lamp in minutes. More than 1 million of these stoves went into the hands of American troops across Europe and Asia. Historians studying the war's logistics have placed it in the same category of importance as the Jeep. Not a weapon, but a piece of equipment that kept soldiers alive and functioning when nothing else could. That's not a small comparison. The Jeep moved men and supplies across impossible terrain. The pocket stove let a soldier melt snow for water, heat a ration, or dry out wet socks in weather that could kill through hypothermia alone. Neither device fired a single bullet. Both devices saved lives anyway. Building that stove meant retooling the entire Wichita plant. Machines that once turned out lanterns for farmhouses now turned out stoves for battlefields. Civilian production slowed to a trickle. Military contracts took over the factory floor almost completely. It was proof that the same equipment, the same workers, and the same engineering discipline built for rural Kansas could pivot, almost overnight, into a wartime supply chain the U.S. military depended on. The company's name changed again to reflect what it had become. The Coleman Lamp and Stove Company. Lamps alone no longer described the business, and hadn't for years. The engineering problem behind the pocket stove wasn't simple. It had to burn gasoline under pressure, the same core idea behind every Coleman lamp since 1903, but now inside a casing small enough for a pocket and rugged enough for combat. Cold temperatures, rough handling, constant movement. All of it worked against a stable flame. Coleman solved it using decades of accumulated knowledge about pressurized fuel systems. Knowledge that started with one broken lamp in an Alabama drugstore window. There's a personal thread running through all of this, too. William Coleman wasn't just a manufacturer sitting behind a desk in some distant city. He had served as mayor of Wichita from 1923 to 1924. One term, elected by the very community his factory employed. When that factory retooled for war, it wasn't an abstract corporation answering a distant government contract. It was a hometown company, run by a man who had once led that hometown, doing what its city needed it to do. Chapter 6. Post-war boom and the birth of an American pastime. William Coleman died on November 2nd, 1957, in the city he'd built his company around. He was 87 years old, and he'd lived long enough to see a rented lamp turn into a name known across the country. His son, Sheldon Coleman, took over the business. His grandson, Sheldon C. Coleman, stood right behind him, ready to carry it further. They inherited the company at exactly the right moment. The years after the war reshaped ordinary American life. Factory jobs paid better. Paychecks stretched further. A growing middle class could suddenly afford something their parents never could: leisure time and a car to spend it in. The national park system expanded right alongside this new prosperity, drawing families out of cities and into open country they'd never seen before. That combination created something new: car camping. Load up the trunk, drive out past the last streetlight, and sleep under stars instead of a ceiling. It wasn't a niche hobby anymore. It was becoming a national habit. Coleman didn't just watch this happen. The company built the equipment that made it possible. Tents replaced makeshift shelters. Sleeping bags replaced blankets nobody wanted to ruin. Coolers kept food and drinks cold for days at a time, solving a problem that had limited camping trips for generations. The lineup didn't stop at outdoor gear either. Heaters and even air conditioners rolled off the same production lines, stretching the Coleman name into home comfort, as well as wilderness survival. By the 1960s, something had shifted in how people talked about the brand. Nobody said they were going camping. They said they were taking the Coleman stuff. The name had stopped being a company and started being a category. The default word for an entire kind of American life. For a generation of kids, a Coleman lantern hissing to life at dusk wasn't a product demonstration. It was the sound of summer vacation starting. One object captured all of it better than anything else. The cooler. Painted a shade of green that became instantly recognizable, it showed up everywhere a family gathered outdoors. Beaches, ballparks, backyard barbecues, highway rest stops on the way to somewhere else entirely. It didn't need a logo people could read from a distance. The color alone did the job. None of this happened by accident. The company that started by renting out unreliable lamps for $1 a week had spent half a century building a reputation for equipment that simply worked, no matter where you took it. That reputation was the real inheritance Sheldon Coleman received in 1957. Not just factories and patents, but decades of trust that had never once been broken. By the time the 1960s ended, Coleman wasn't chasing the American camping boom anymore. It had become the reason the boom looked the way it did. Every green cooler in every trunk, every hissing lantern at every campsite, carried a piece of that Alabama drugstore window forward into a country that had, by now, almost forgotten where the light originally came from. Chapter 7. Peak. Coleman, a manufacturing giant. By its peak, Coleman wasn't a Kansas company anymore, not really. It was a Kansas company that happened to manufacture across 8 states and 6 foreign countries, with production lines running on 3 different continents at once. Wichita still sat at the center of it all. Most of the workforce stayed rooted there, in the same city where William Coleman had once served as mayor, in factories that traced their lineage straight back to Plant A. But the reach of the operation had stretched far beyond anything a single city, or even a single country, could contain. That scale turned Coleman into one of Kansas's leading exporters. Think about what that actually meant. A company built by a broke traveling salesman, headquartered in a state better known for wheat fields than heavy industry, was now shipping products around the world in volumes large enough to matter to the entire state's economy. Lanterns designed to light up a single drugstore window in 1899 were now crossing oceans by the container load. The product line had grown into something closer to an ecosystem than a catalog. Lamps and lanterns, the original business, still rolled off the line. Stoves and heaters covered anything a lamp couldn't. Tents and sleeping bags handled shelter and rest. Coolers handled food and drink. Somewhere in the mix, air conditioners covered the opposite problem entirely. Not staying warm, but staying cool. Whatever an American family needed to survive comfortably outdoors, Coleman had already built it, tested it, and put its name on it. This wasn't just a business strategy anymore. It had become a cultural position. Coleman didn't sell individual products so much as it sold access to an idea. The great American outdoors, packaged and ready to load into a car trunk. National parks provided the backdrop. Summer road trips provided the occasion. Coleman provided everything in between. The light at the campsite, the heat on a cold morning, the cold drink at the end of a long drive. Families didn't think of these as separate purchases. They thought of them as a single kit for a single kind of life. One built around long weekends, open highways, and evenings spent somewhere far from a paved street. Buy the tent, and you'd probably already own the lantern. Buy the lantern, and the cooler wasn't far behind. Each product reinforced the next, and together they formed something no single competitor could easily replicate. A complete, trusted system for experiencing the outdoors, all carrying the same name. By any measure, this was the top. 8 states, 6 countries, one of Kansas's largest exporters. A product line broad enough to outfit an entire vacation from a single brand. A cultural foothold so deep that taking the Coleman stuff had become shorthand for camping itself. And yet, peaks in business rarely announce themselves as peaks while they're happening. Nobody standing on a factory floor in Wichita during these years could have pointed to a calendar date and said, "This is as big as it gets." There was no single warning sign, no obvious crack in the foundation. A company this large, this trusted, and this deeply woven into American life looked, from the outside, like something built to last forever. So the real question isn't how Coleman reached this scale. It's what happens to a family-run business once it grows too large for any one family to fully control anymore, and where the first crack actually begins to show. Chapter 8. The First Cracks. A Hostile Takeover. Every empire assumes it controls its own future. In 1989, Coleman found out it didn't. That year, a New York investor named Ron Perelman set his sights on the Kansas company. He didn't approach the Coleman family with an offer to discuss over dinner. He moved through McAndrews and Forbes Holdings, his investment firm, and bought up shares aggressively enough to seize control outright. In corporate language, this is called a hostile takeover. Strip away the jargon, and the idea is simple. You don't need permission from the people running a company. You just need enough shares to outvote them. Buy control on the open market, whether current leadership wants to sell or not, and the decision gets made for them. That's exactly what happened here. For almost 90 years, the name on the door and the family in charge had been the same. William Coleman started it. His son Sheldon ran it next. His grandson, Sheldon C. Coleman, carried it forward after that. 3 generations, 1 bloodline, 1 continuous hand on the wheel since a rented lamp in Oklahoma Territory back in 1900. In 1989, that continuity ended. Control shifted to a financier most Wichita workers had never met and would likely never meet, a man with no history in Kansas and no personal stake in the lanterns, still hissing to life at campsites across the country. The shift wasn't just symbolic. It changed how decisions got made from that point forward. A family running its own company for generations tends to think in decades. A financial holding company tends to think in quarters. One measures success by whether the business still stands for the next generation. The other measures it by return on investment, calculated far more often and far more coldly. That difference showed up almost immediately. By the end of 1989, the company had drafted plans to retire older factories and shift production elsewhere. The word retire sounds gentle. What it meant in practice was closure. Buildings that had run for decades, some of them since the 1920s, were now line items in a restructuring plan instead of landmarks in a hometown's industrial history. Plant A absorbed the full weight of that shift. This was the 4-story brick building raised in 1929, the physical heart of Coleman manufacturing for more than 60 years. Lanterns that lit farmhouses before rural electrification ever reached them. GI pocket stoves that soldiers carried through the Second World War. Postwar coolers and tents that fueled an entire generation's idea of summer vacation. All of it had, at some point, passed through that building. In 1990, Plant A officially retired. The machines went silent. The floor that had once employed generations of Wichita families sat empty. Its purpose gone the moment ownership decided it no longer fit the balance sheet. None of this happened because customers stopped buying lanterns, or because the products had failed, or because some competitor had built something better. The factory didn't lose to bad engineering. It lost to a change in who was making the decisions and why. That's the real significance of 1989. It wasn't simply a change in ownership on paper. It was the moment control passed from people who had grown up walking that factory floor to people who had never set foot on it at all. The Coleman name would survive. The products would keep selling. But the company that made them would never again be run by the family whose name was stamped across every lantern and every stove. The crack was small at first. Just one factory retired quietly in 1990. Nobody outside Wichita paid it much attention. But cracks like this one rarely stay small. And this one was about to spread a lot further than a single building. Chapter 9. Sold again and again. Sunbeam, bankruptcy, and Jarden 1 takeover rarely ends a company's story. It just opens the door for the next one. In 1998, Sunbeam Products bought Coleman outright. And with that sale came a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to William Coleman himself. The headquarters moved, not to a bigger building in Wichita, not even to another city in Kansas. It moved all the way to Boca Raton, Florida, nearly 1,500 miles from the streets where the company had been founded. Think about what that distance actually severed. For almost 100 years, Coleman's decision-makers had walked the same sidewalks as its factory workers. They'd shopped in the same stores. Some had even served the city as mayor. Now the people setting strategy sat in a Florida office park, managing a Kansas legacy from a beach town that had nothing to do with lanterns, coal towns, or drugstore windows in Alabama. The relationship between the brand and its hometown had officially become long distance. And long-distance relationships, in business as much as anywhere else, tend to fray. Sunbeam's ownership didn't last long, and it didn't end well. In 2001, the company filed for bankruptcy. Coleman didn't disappear in the process, but it emerged from the wreckage under a different corporate umbrella, restructured into a new entity called American Household, Inc. The name Coleman still meant something to customers. Behind the scenes, though, it was just one asset among many, being shuffled through a bankruptcy court's reorganization plan. The damage wasn't only happening in boardrooms. It was happening on factory floors, too. And this part of the story comes with paperwork to prove it. Between 2002 and 2003, the U.S. Department of Labor investigated a petition filed on behalf of workers at Coleman facilities in Wichita and nearby Maize, Kansas. The case, filed under number TAW 53/733, documented something specific. Sales and production employment had dropped as imported propane appliances competed directly with what these Kansas workers were making by hand. The investigation confirmed enough of a connection to imports that the affected workers qualified for Federal Trade Adjustment Assistance, a program that exists specifically to help American employees whose jobs were lost to foreign competition. That's not speculation. That's a federal case file, with a number attached describing exactly what globalization looked like on the ground in Wichita, Kansas in the early 2000s. Cheaper imported goods weren't a distant economic trend anymore. They were showing up on paperwork with real names of real employees who'd lost real income. Then, in 2004, ownership changed hands again. American Household was acquired by the Jarden Corporation, a company built almost entirely through acquisitions like this one. Jarden's portfolio read like a supermarket shelf. Yankee Candle for scented wax, Mr. Coffee for kitchen counters, Crock Pot for slow-cooked dinners, and now Coleman for camping gear. Each of these had once been an independent company with its own founder, its own factory, its own hometown story. Under Jarden, they became line items in a single sprawling consumer goods conglomerate. Coleman was no longer competing in the marketplace as Coleman. It was a division, a brand name attached to a product category, managed alongside dozens of other brand names attached to dozens of other product categories, all judged by the same spreadsheet, all reporting to the same distant leadership. Look at the timeline stacked together, and the pattern is impossible to miss. One takeover in 1989, one relocation in 1998, one bankruptcy in 2001, One acquisition in 2004. 15 years. 4 separate upheavals. Not one of them involved a failure of the lanterns, the stoves, or the coolers themselves. Customers kept buying. The products kept working exactly as advertised. The company built on trust, on $1-a-week lamp rental and a promise to fix what broke, had itself become something that broke again and again at the ownership level. And each time it broke, it got picked up by someone a little further removed from Wichita, a little less connected to the story that started with a broke law student and a glowing drugstore window in 1899. Chapter 10. What the Lantern Left Behind. The chain of ownership didn't stop with Jarden. In 2016, Newell Rubbermaid completed a deal worth somewhere between $15 and $16 billion, absorbing Jarden entirely and renaming the combined company Newell Brands. Coleman didn't get a headline of its own in that announcement. It became one name among dozens on a very long list. Sharpie, Rubbermaid, Yankee Candle, Mr. Coffee, and now Coleman, all filed under the same corporate roof. That's where Coleman sits today. A subsidiary of Newell Brands, employing roughly 4,000 people, still maintaining facilities in Wichita, Kansas, and in Texas. The name survives. The products still sell. But the company that carries William Coleman's name hasn't been an independent business, answering to nobody but itself in decades. Picture 2 images side by side. The first is Wichita today. A Coleman factory outlet still operates there, selling current products at a discount. For years, it held a small museum tucked into one corner of the store. A modest tribute to a company whose history stretched back more than 100 years, condensed into a few hundred square feet of display cases. The second image is the company at its peak. Factories running across 8 states and 6 countries, one of Kansas's leading exporters, shipping camping gear to families on multiple continents. A product line broad enough to outfit an entire American vacation, all under one name, all built on trust that started with a single $1-a-week lamp rental in 1900. A 100-year story and a global manufacturing footprint now fit inside a corner of a discount outlet store. That contrast isn't an exaggeration for effect. It's just what the paperwork and the property records actually show. So, what does this story actually teach once you strip away the nostalgia? The first lesson sits right at the beginning, in 1899. Coleman didn't build an empire by inventing something nobody had ever imagined. He built it by fixing a specific, ordinary problem for people who badly needed it fixed. Rural families needed reliable light, and the products available to them kept failing. Coleman didn't just sell a better lamp. He sold a promise that it would keep working, backed by a $1-a-week rental plan that put the risk on his own shoulders instead of the customers. Real innovation, this story suggests, rarely starts with a grand vision. It starts with paying close attention to a problem everyone else has learned to live with. The second lesson is harder to sit with because it cuts against everything the first lesson seems to promise. Solving a real problem, building a trusted brand, and becoming a genuine piece of American culture. None of it made Coleman immune to what came next. The moment control left the founding family's hands in 1989, the company entered a different kind of story entirely. Over the following 25 years, it moved through a hostile takeover, a corporate relocation, a bankruptcy, and 2 more acquisitions, each one driven by financial logic that had nothing to do with how well the lanterns lit or how reliably the stoves burned. Global competition and cheap imports did their own damage along the way, well documented in a federal labor case bearing Coleman's name. A product can be brilliant, beloved, and completely embedded in a culture, and still get absorbed, piece by piece, into a spreadsheet run by people who never once camped under a Coleman lantern. Go back to where this all began. A broke, degreeless law student, walking a dirt street in a poor Alabama coal town, in 1899. Stopped by a lamp burning white-hot in a drugstore window. He couldn't have known that single moment would eventually arm over 1 million soldiers, define an entire generation's idea of summer, and outlive 3 corporate owners and 2 bankruptcies. That light is still burning today, in millions of garages and campsites across the country, hissing to life the same way it always has. But the company standing behind it has traveled a far longer, far stranger road than the man who first saw it ever could have imagined. From a drugstore window in Alabama, to a boardroom in Boca Raton, to a single line item inside a $16 billion conglomerate most people have never heard of. The lantern kept its glow. The company it built didn't get to keep its independence.